my talk. Here we go. How he said he living life as a gringo, where you question where you fit in every time you mingle. They say you do this with not enough that. My rapping is really bad. This life as a gringo.
Yes, hello and welcome to Life as a Gringo. I am Dramos, of course. Man, I know I've been heavy on the guests to start off this season, which has been absolutely incredible. I know last week we did a talk that I gave, a public speech that I gave, which I thought was really, just powerful as far as, Latin Heritage Month goes, and speaking to some of the things that, our community goes through. But now I kind of wanted to get in my bag a little bit and do more of a one-on-one show here for today's episode. And it only felt right, given some of the things I've been having go on in my personal life, some of the conversations I've been having, some of the, breakthroughs I feel like I've been having. It only felt right to kind of bring that to today's show. And this is going to be an extension of one of my more popular episodes from last season. And this is part 2 of our mental health exploration, and again, it's never ending. So there's going to be 1,000,001 different versions of this show and new discoveries and ideas and things like that. But I wanted to make this officially our mental health episode part 2. I know I did it again, like I said, last year. Obviously, we did it last year for part 1, and that's been one of the more popular episodes from season 1, as well as one of the ones that, so many of you guys just have reached out to me in regards to, so it only felt right to kind of do a more updated one, especially because, like I said, I've been stewing on so much in my own personal life. I've been having a lot of conversations with my girlfriend. I had a lot of discoveries about, childhood trauma that's been reoccurring in my life and where a lot of my depression or anxiety comes from. I had a crazy conversation with my parents over the weekend that was really just beautiful, just kind of opening up to some of my experiences and also having them a little bit open up to me about some of their experiences. So I thought it was just appropriate to kind of tackle this topic and do it from a different angle than we did previously. Now, I do want to obviously talk about the numbers specifically when it comes to the Latin community and the mental health issues that we face, as well as the lack of treatment for these issues. There's various barriers as far as why our community, doesn't make this a priority, doesn't believe in it, whatever the case may be. But there are numbers to back up, the just mental health issues that run rampant in the Latin community. So we'll get into a deep dive of that in our For the People in the Back segment. For our Mi Gente segment, I want to give you guys a little insight into kind of what I've been going through, what kind of motivated me to bring this to the table for today's episode, as well as kind of this recipe I've created for, trying to maintain a healthy mind, and to combat some of these negative thoughts that do creep up, and how to try and just stay healthy and understand what I need to find that balance, right? So we'll talk about that in the Mi Gente segment. And then for our Ask a Gringo segment, I want to get y'all's take. I want to hear what you guys do for your own mental health. How do you try and keep sane in this world? So we'll get into all that, man. But first, let's do our deep dive in a segment we call For the People in the Back.
Say it louder for the people in the
Man, it's funny. I'm feeling rusty when it comes to doing these solo episodes a little bit. So bear with me if I'm a bit all over the place. But I pulled up a few different articles just to kind of reference some topics. Now, specifically, this one is all about the Latin community and their mental health issues, right? And our mental health issues, I should say. So this is from Medical News Today. I'm going to read a bunch of different stats that they had. I just found it to be super fascinating in different areas. And I just thought it was really eye-opening, And the first thing they say is, quote, evidence suggests that more than 16% or approximately 10 million people in the U.S. Latinx community report having a mental health condition. And research also indicates that serious mental health conditions among the Latin population are increasing. Compared with the U.S. average of 45%, around 34% of Latinx adults with a mental health condition receive treatments, man. So we are below average in the U.S. when it comes to receiving treatment for our mental health issues. They go on to say Latinx people are less likely to obtain treatment due to obstacles such as language barriers, poverty, and stigma. Mental health stigma can negatively influence how people perceive and treat mental health conditions. This may be particularly true in the Latin American communities, as research indicates that they may hold prejudices towards those with mental health conditions, right? And they go on to say, I'm reading a bunch from it because I thought it was super profound. I'll put the link to this article in the show notes if you want to read the whole entire thing. But they go on to say, quote, because elements of Latinx culture may harbor negative attitudes towards mental health, it could discourage and prevent people from seeking help due to fear of discrimination or bringing shame to their family, right? And it's crazy because you think about our community or many immigrant communities, we also bear the burden of like being a representation for the world of our community, right? And I talked about that a bit in the talk that I gave that I put in last week's episode, but that's like a whole nother shame, that comes along with like, if you fail, you've failed your entire community. And at least that's what many of us have kind of been brought up to sort of feel like, Now, they go on to say that Latin communities living in the U.S. may perceive a lower need for mental health care. A 2019 study notes that Latinx populations access mental health care roughly half of the rate as non-Latin white people in the U.S. Man, half, bro. And it's not surprising. You think about it. We're always like taught that mental health isn't a real thing. I mean, pray it away, go to church, and it'll solve all this, right? And it's just crazy to think about that. Like, man, we have so much trauma, and I covered this in the first iteration of the mental health topic, so I'm not going to be too redundant. But when you talk about the trauma of immigrating to this country, of facing things like racism, of, man, like we talked about my guest Doris, where you're facing the trauma of being scared that your family may be taken from you at any moment because they're not legal citizens, they don't have paperwork, right? All of that creates very unique trauma for our community, and I'm gonna kind of start paraphrasing some of the stuff in this article because it's a lot, but research from Mental Health America also highlights increases in major depressive episodes from Latin people of all ages between 2015 and 2018. And it actually goes on to say that a study in 2018 talks about how Latinx people are significantly more likely to experience serious depression than white people. I mean, all kinds of statistics that dictate we actually are more likely to experience mental health issues, right? And this was actually a crazy one. It's a bit selfish as a Puerto Rican, but they say, quote, the research suggests that people with a Puerto Rican background may be at the highest risk of depressive symptoms. And they also talk about how at the beginning of the pandemic, depression was higher in Latin adults. It's just crazy that when you break it down like that, it's depression is higher in Puerto Ricans. And man, like, you just think so much about our community and like the shit we have to face on a regular basis, right? And it is just a perfect recipe for, mental health crisis, right? There's no other way sort of around that, right? And then the lack of support from our community just continues to ignite that fire. I mean, and this continues on with depression. Again, I mentioned, Puerto Ricans, and they're talking about how the prevalence of depressive symptoms in Latinos is due to multiple factors, but their Latin background is a part of that, right? There's like a level of trauma that comes along with that, and anxiety is a part of that as well. They do all kinds of studies that talk about anxiety being a common mental health condition throughout the Latinx community, similar to depression. I mean, it says that a 2020 study exploring healthcare use among uninsured Latinx people notes that anxiety disorders accounted for 16% of mental health diagnoses. So, you have so many things that are also made to feel like they're not real, or maybe they're just not spoken about. Like, to touch on something I was talking about with my parents, when I mentioned we had this big conversation, I'll elaborate a bit more, but I was like bringing up to my mom, like, that my grandmother, her mother, had anxiety and she pushed that down to her. And my mom had to like sit there and think about it for a second. It was as if that never even came to her brain. You know what I mean? Like, it's never been a common conversation for her age group in our community, But to me, like, being somebody who is experiencing things myself, but also been trying to do so much work on learning about it and combating it and being an advocate for it, it's like clear as day to see it, right? But it just shows you the generational gap in our communities and if we don't take the time to put forth the effort to learn about this stuff, we're only just going to keep having the same cycle go on and on, right? Last thing I'll talk about when it comes to this, actually second to last, they also talk about the prevalence of PTSD in the Latinx community, right? And race-related stressors, being a part of that, right? And that can affect your physical and mental health, right? Because your mental health can have an effect on you physically, right? And last thing I'll mention that they talk about is the idea of alcohol use disorder is actually a common mental health condition among Latinx, with some sources noting that Latin adolescents are more likely to start using alcohol than Black and Asian youth, right? So there's so much there, within this conversation of mental health, specifically when it comes to our community. I think the general consensus there is, and I was just kind of like going quickly through the stats because I think it's a bit repetitive after a while, right? It's like, yeah, we have an issue with mental health in our community, and we're not really doing anything about it in large numbers, right? In fact, we're below average when it comes to seeking treatment and help for this than any other demographic in this country, right? And it's just sad to see. And again, the stigmas. I mean, and this is prevalent in the Black community as well. Obviously, someone like Charlamagne the God has been a huge advocate for therapy within the Black community. But for people of color, it's just so crazy to me how we think we can just like pray away our problems or we sweep them under the rug. But we're facing levels of trauma and traumatic experiences that other ethnicities don't necessarily relate to, right? Again, you talk about the idea of racism and the trauma and stress that brings on and then shows up in real ways in our lives, be it our mental health and then eventually our physical health, So I just kind of wanted to read some of those stats. I did dive a bit deeper into some of it, again, in the first version of this conversation that I did for last season's episode. I think it was episode 3, if I'm not mistaken, or episode 2, one of them. But if you're interested in kind of hearing more specific stats, how they pertain to the Latin community, I really dove deep into that one and talked about the mental health numbers amongst families who have immigrated and all of the above. Now, for today's show, to kind of make it a little bit different, I also wanted to dive into a bit of the conversations that I've been having personally in my life with trusted ones, but also some of the work that I've been doing to try and combat these depression, depressive episodes I go through, whatever the technical term is. I just kind of call it like this negative storm, this wave that you go through of dread, and speaking for myself, and I can assume many people can relate to that. So I kind of want to just take you a bit through what I've been discovering and how I've been actively trying to combat it, and also the sort of results of that, right? The beautiful results of me doing this work and having these conversations. So let's dive into that in our Mi Gente segment. But first, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be right back. Mi Gente. All right, we are back. All right, so like I said, I've been really heavy on this conversation as of late, and I wasn't even originally planning on doing an episode about this until literally I was getting ready to kind of like prep for the show, and it was just kind of I don't know. My gut always when it comes to picking topics for the show is whatever is like been heavy on my heart or on my shoulders. I just bring it to the podcast and trust that if I'm going through these things and somebody out there can probably relate to it, right? I know a lot of people like pre-record podcasts, so many episodes in advance and things like that. But I like to kind of really just like be going through it with y'all as you listen to this, and try to make it as in real time as possible. Just a little kind of anecdote. But like I said, I've been having a lot of these conversations as of late because, I've been really taking great strides within my mental health and not necessarily in like perfectly healing it or anything like that, but pushing myself to explore it deeper. And this started, with towards the end of the summer, getting back into therapy. I've been kind of on and off with it over the last few years. I got back into that. And then through that, sort of recognizing these sort of waves that I was having of depression and sort of despair, and noticing that they were lasting for far longer than felt healthy, So that sort of led me to exploring for the first time medication, and I got a psychiatrist, and they prescribed me with some antidepressants. I took some like exams, and I had what they would call kind of severe depression, like a kind of borderline, severe depression, and then anxiety. The anxiety wasn't as bad, right? So they treat me for depression, and they prescribed me Wellbutrin. This isn't an ad for Wellbutrin. I'm still, the jury's still out for me if it's working. But my point being, I am really just like hitting it hard right now. And then also, like I said, having the conversations. And one thing has been amazing for me is having somebody in my life that I can have these types of talks with, and that understands it. My girlfriend being that person. And if you've been following the show, at the end of last year, I went away on like a personal growth retreat called the Hoffman Process. And I learned a lot. And their whole premise is like that many of the things that we suffer with as adults, the trauma, all can be traced back to our relationship with our parents as kids, right? So for me, a lot of feelings of unworthiness, a lot of feelings of not being good enough, right, have always been very prevalent for me in my life. And one of the things that was really profound that I unlocked recently with talking to my girlfriend was that I've kind of been in this trauma loop, right? And it's actually the same feelings that I had as a kid, as a young teenager, sitting in my parents' basement and at the computer, like by myself, and like feeling like, nobody wanted to spend time with me, and I had a complicated relationship with many of my friends that was kind of hot and cold, right? And I spent a lot of time in my parents' basement, on the computer, just sad and depressed and lonely. And what I realized was that I'm like having this sort of subconscious, almost like habit come up. And it's been happening recently. I moved into a new studio here, and we have like an office area, and I'll be sitting at that computer in the office area, and like that feeling of dread would come over me, and I'd feel sad, I'd feel alone. And I recognized that it's actually like literally the same exact feelings I was feeling as a kid, right? So long story short is that I've just been almost out of habit, and it's just like breathing or walking, right? You don't think about those things. Your body just automatically does it. I believe that, and I'm not a doctor, but for me, what I feel like I've begun to uncover is that like my body subconsciously automatically goes into these habits, and there's little triggers that I'm maybe not even aware of. But again, sitting in a room by myself at a computer, like that, and kind of looking out the window, it for whatever reason was triggering some of those same feelings of loneliness. And I recognized that, okay, I'm reliving my same childhood trauma as a kid. And obviously those same things that I was upset about don't exist anymore. I've done a lot of healing work, but my body is still out of habit going into that mode, into that feeling, right? So that like recognition was super inspiring, because for me, for the longest time, I always just assumed there was something genetically wrong with me, right? And I'm going to quickly pull this up. My girlfriend was kind enough to text me this podcast, right? It's from the Tim Ferriss Show. It's another podcast. But he has this Dr. Gabor Mate on, right? And his argument is that there has never been proof that depression is actually a genetic gene, right? And he thinks that in inherited sensitivity, like he thinks sensitivity is actually the gene that's inherited, is actually what causes mental health conditions, right? So our sensitivity, our ability to maybe feel too much is actually something that we can inherit from our parents. And I think there's terms like empaths, you can look that up. Certain people who almost can just feel too much, they are susceptible to depression. And I recognize that in myself. So long story short, all of this information, recognizing that there's not something genetically wrong with me, right? And that these feelings of dread are learned behavior, and they're literally a habit that my body created, and it just continues to relive it, even if the moment isn't real anymore, right? It just keeps finding ways through triggers in the environment to put me back in this mode, And that sort of felt so freeing, which I know sounds weird because of the fact that I'm in my 30s and I'm still living with the same trauma and feelings of dread and depression that were prevalent in my early teens. But it's freeing because I know that there is an answer for this, right? I know that I'm not broken. There's nothing wrong with me. I just have to figure out how to, have my mind break this habit, right? I have to figure out how to get out of this habit slowly but surely. There's like a recipe, and I'm going to get into that in a minute, but there has to be a plan of action. Like there's a light at the end of the tunnel in that recognition, in knowing that this is simply just a habit that my body has adapted and continues to go on and from, childhood to now. And it's like this never-ending trauma loop, right? That's kind of what I've been calling it. I don't know if that's the technical term. Again, I'm not a doctor. I'm just being honest with you about my own shit. And hopefully it pushes you to start doing some of that work on yourself and research and all of the above, right? But, this then leads me to the conversation with my parents, because I think figuring that out really gave me this level of confidence. And I'll, not drag this out too long, but I had a really beautiful conversation with my parents over the weekend where we just really dove into all this stuff, and I told them that I was on medication, which for me is huge when you think about the fact that the first time that I told them I wanted to get therapy, I secretly had to tell my mom, and I felt so much shame about it, right? To now fast forwarding, feeling comfortable to nonchalantly mention that I'm on, antidepressants, and this is why. And we had a really beautiful, like, civilized conversation where I just talked to them about many of the things that I went through as a result of their parenting, and with the knowledge that they weren't doing it to hurt me. They were unaware. They were passing on their own traumas, And one thing that I've recognized from the Hoffman process and then in this conversation is that, my parents felt, that their own parents, didn't believe in them, right? They had a lot of confidence issues that people, didn't make them feel worthy. And unknowingly, they looked at me through that same lens almost, like their ceiling was only but so high because of their own personal things, right? So they gave me that same low ceiling, right? And unknowingly, made me feel very similar. Now, my parents did a great job of breaking the chains of making sure we felt loved, which is something that, my parents have described from certain, ones of their parents, that they didn't feel that way, right? So they made great strides, but there was, certain things missing that caused some of this depression inside of me. And, again, referencing Gabor Mate, but he talks about how depression is created by an inability to express oneself, right? So if as a kid you are told you can't express yourself fully, that your opinions aren't valid, that's what begins to create that depression. It's the inability to express oneself. So with that in mind, it was so powerful to be able to fully express myself authentically to my parents with some really tough conversations, but to be able to get that off of my chest, to be able to get that pain off of my chest, was amazing. And then for them to share some of their experiences, they, one of them in particular has to do a bit more work before I think they're ready to really open up about all that they went through, but it was just a great moment of kind of sharing some of our experiences. And again, to me, is like the fruits of the work that I'm doing right now, it's showing me how far I've come on my journey. And I just wanted to kind of throw that little antidote in there, because anybody that is struggling with any of these things, it's often freeing to be able to talk about them and to face your demons, right? To face that monster in the closet, even if it doesn't go as well as mine did. I think there is something to, making yourself heard and seen, and regardless of how the other person or the other people react, at least knowing that you didn't hide how you felt, right? That you were unafraid to truly express yourself in that moment. And that's so much power right there. That's your authenticity. And like I always say, that is your superpower. And I felt incredibly energized afterwards. I still feel it today. I feel incredibly confident. And again, I'm floating on that high, but it's like unlocking another part of myself, leveling up to that next level, in my life. And it's just an incredible feeling. And the last thing I kind of want to touch on specifically is sort of the exact, I think, feelings of depression that I've been going through, but I think also some of the causes, because I think that there is, a really interesting thing to be said and an interesting correlation between artists, who have, historically, right, mental health issues sort of go hand to hand oftentimes with people who are in the art world or are musicians or whatever the case may be. And there's a lot of studies and research that kind of showcase, why that might be. And I read this article on healthline.com, and it was called External Depression, and it was called Existential Depression: What to Do When Your Search for Meaning Overwhelms You. And it just hit close to home, because that idea of the search for meaning is something I can remember as a kid having, right? Like always questioning, why am I here? I can even remember there's this movie called Simon Birch when I was a kid, and in it, Simon Birch is a dwarf, and he believes that God created him that way for a reason, right? So he believes his entire existence is for a reason. And that, like, as a kid, clicked with me, and I just felt like there's a reason for me to be here, and I always questioned, what I was doing and why I was doing it, right? And I guess that's that overall existential question of like life. Why are we here, right? But also that comes with so much of a burden, because I think you're far more aware of what's going on around you, good or bad, right? And you feel it that much more. And that's what I talked about with the idea of empaths. I think that's what Dr. Gabor Mate is talking about with the idea of people being able to inherit sensitivity, right? And that can lead you down a road of depression, but, there are a lot of questions that they reference in this article, and they say, quote, at some point in life, you might begin to consider complex questions like, why do people suffer? What happens after death? What's the point of my life? What if I never find love? And those are all, I think, kind of basic questions. They're not necessarily groundbreaking. I think the one that sticks to me is the idea of wondering what's the point of life, and not only just kind of asking it, in passing, but genuinely like wanting to give it some sort of meaning. And they say, quote, as you struggle to find meaning in pain, distress, and injustice, you might experience some apprehension, even fear. These feelings are commonly known as existential dread. And they go on to say that, quote, existential angst can also leave you with a sense of despair for the world and your future, right? And I think about this, I mean, there are so many things that happen in the world, and that, when I have to like unplug, right? And I think it's natural and normal for any of us to, and I'm just speaking personally, I'm not making like I'm some special case, but I know for me personally, there are times I have to just stop watching the news. I have to get off of getting the updates on some horrendous story. And it's not because I don't care, but it's because I feel it too much, and it puts me in this really dreadful place. And I think beyond just feeling bad or empathy for the people that are going through it, for whatever reason, watching these things and not having a personal connection to it, but just kind of seeing it, I almost take on their pain. I don't know. It's interesting because in my personal life, I often have times, disconnect from the things that are right in front of me. I think for whatever reason, I find it easier when it's a stranger to just kind of like connect to pain. But when I think about even why I fell in love with music, it was because I genuinely felt something. When a singer was saying something a certain way, a certain lyric, a certain melody, like it invoked a real tangible feeling inside of me, and I don't know how else to explain it. It just was something that I truly felt. I felt the sadness, the dread, the happiness, whatever it was that was coming through, whatever emotion they were trying to evoke. It's been really easy for me to tap into that. And I think also the idea of not having control, right? They go on to say, quote, without answers, without any sense of meaning or control over your eventual fate, you might begin to feel hopeless, unmotivated, and unable to stop cycling through the same largely unanswerable questions, right? And again, if this is resonating for anybody, I'm going to put the link in the show notes. This is like existential depression, where you just become overcome with dread, thinking about those bigger ideas, and the world around you. And again, I think the idea of artists, why they're probably so susceptible to this is because artists are tapping into their emotion as a job, right? That's what they do. They're tapping into feelings, and you have to kind of be able to do that on demand, right? In your artistry. And you're inspired by all things around you, but that makes you incredibly aware and present. That means to your environment, right? In order to get that spark of inspiration from watching a show or being, in a city, and that like being the thing that drives you to go create, it means that you're like emotionally tapping into your environment, and that could be good. But again, if it's a negative environment, that means it brings on those feelings of dread, And last thing I'll read on this topic of existential questioning when it comes to depression. They say that it generally centers around four main topics, and that is death, including the awareness of its inevitability and what happens afterwards, freedom, or the sheer magnitude of choices, right, and consequences available to you in life, isolation or disconnection from others, and the eventual loss of important relationships. And the last one they say is meaningless or wondering what point your life has. And a lot of that resonates to me. I've always had this obsession with death, and it sounds dark to say this, but I'm saying it because I know that I heard somebody else talk about it once. I think Chris Rivas actually recently talked about it, but I felt comfortable when somebody else said it, so I want to say it to whoever needs to hear it. But I've oftentimes sort of fantasized about what my funeral would be like, and not because I wanted to be dead, but because I just wanted to know what it would be like, right? I wanted to know who would come, what would they say, right? And I think those are all kind of these existential questions that we ask ourselves if you kind of are of that certain personality type, right? And again, having so many choices and freedoms, like, at times that can lead to, going down a road of depression, especially now kind of being pretty much 100% self-employed. I think I often feel overwhelmed by the amount of choices, that I have. And then I sort of feel shame when I go down the rabbit hole of one thing and I feel like, oh, I could have done this or I could have done that, right? And it's like, again, too many choices bring me that depression and isolation. Man, I have a tendency to isolate myself for sure from people while I'm trying to figure out stuff and wondering what the point of life is, and oftentimes pointing out the meaninglessness of like what I might be doing, have always been a big thing, especially in career. And they give a whole list of things, that are reflective of existential depression. I'm not going to read off, a lot. I think we just kind of talked about that a bit in that list. Again, it's healthline.com. I'll put the link in the show notes if you want to read the full-on article. And last thing I want to close on that is also recognizing that, like, again, kids who are incredibly intelligent or creative or emotionally aware, self-aware, or human beings, adults who share those same traits, are oftentimes the ones who suffer the most just because they feel too much, right? And I hope that resonates with people listening, because that like is the best way that I can describe it. Like I've always said, I feel the highs way too high and I feel the lows way too low. And that was also part of me wanting to get medication, was to kind of regulate that, because the sort of roller coaster ride of that fucked me up enough. Like even the highs being so high gave me anxiety, and yeah, I think that sensitivity gene unlocks a lot, again, when you recognize that there's not something inherently wrong with you. You're not broken. You don't have something genetically wrong with you because you're depressed or anxious. You just learned that somewhere, right? You learned that behavior. Your body adapted those feelings as a reaction to something you went through. Like, and the recognition of that, again, is to me what sets you free, right? The idea that I don't have to suffer this way forever. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. I just have to figure out the formula that allows me to have my balance needed in order to be mentally healthy, right? And to also, understand that as long as you put in the work, you can find ways to undo these sort of trauma habits that you've developed that send you down this sort of spiral of depressed modes. Again, understand that there's not something inherently wrong with you. There's not something genetically wrong with you, to me, is the ultimate freedom, and means that there is, in fact, a light at the end of the tunnel for whomever wants to do the work. Now, with that in mind, we'll get your take, and I'll give y'all a little perspective quickly on kind of a recipe that I've been developing for my own mental health, and then I'll reference you to the idea of how to create dopamine, that happy feeling inside of you when you are feeling depressed. But first, I want to get y'all's take on what you do. I want y'all to put me onto some game when it comes to what you do when you're feeling down. So we'll get into that for our Ask a Gringo segment. But first, take a quick break, and then we'll be right back.
Ask a Gringo. I have a question.
All right, so I kept this pretty easy. I just asked y'all, what things do you do to help you through stress and anxiety? Because I think it's one thing to talk about depression and anxiety and all these things, but it's another, once again, when you unlock the idea that it doesn't have to be that way forever. And I'm not minimizing, by the way, anybody's feelings, what they're going through. I'm not telling you it isn't real by any stretch of the imagination. As somebody who suffers from depression and anxiety, I can tell you it is, in fact, very real. All I'm saying is it's not a death sentence, and that there is, ways to fight against it if we, want to take the time to learn more about ourselves and where all these feelings in fact come from. So again, it's about taking actions that help you find that balance, to help get you back on the right track when you're feeling yourself begin to steer off into those moments of anxiety or depression. So I wanted y'all to put me onto some stuff. I asked again, what things do you do to help you through stress or anxiety? I got a ton of responses. I don't have time. I'm laughing because I just read one of them. It's funny. I don't have time to get through all of them, but I want to read a few that I got here. Let's see. At mbrown4444 says, workout, bike ride, run, take a shower, listen to music. And yeah, that is a very, sounds very basic, but it actually like chemically releases that dopamine inside of you, right? That's why you feel that like high after a crazy workout, or you play some sports, you're running around, you break that sweat, your body is automatically releasing that dopamine, and that is like the positivity sort of like medicine to a degree, right? Like you want that dopamine, you want to create that combats, stress, anxiety, and depression. It's something that I know my psychiatrist has been getting on me about creating a workout routine, because he believes, as a clinical professional, that working out is also a key to combating, many of these darker feelings. So I think you're onto something there. Let's see, at Talia Falcon, the homie, she's been on the show a few times. She says, workout, therapy every other week, motivational podcasts. And I love all that. Workout again, obviously therapy. I'm a big advocate of it. I actually recently, with that in mind, stopped going to therapy because I just felt like I wasn't getting something out of the talk part. I've done it so much. I recently started working with a life coach, which I think is probably another story I can talk about for another day, but more so just creating actionable steps. And actually, that's a part of the recipe that I'll mention. My conversation with him, as well as ones that I've had with my girlfriend in the past, helped me kind of try and create this like format to make sure I keep myself healthy each and every day mentally. And last thing Talia said was the motivational podcast is what she listens to. And I've noticed that helps me out a lot too. I'm a big fan of Earn Your Leisure, and that's not necessarily a motivational podcast, but they talk about business, and it usually fires me up and like gets me over the hump of like feeling like, oh my God, I'm not inspired, or I can't create something, I'm not good enough. And for me, like hearing people's stories and their struggles and then breaking down how they do certain things, it just like fires me up to like, get that motivation that I'm sometimes like really in need of, when I'm going through depression. But definitely motivational podcasts. I mean, that's kind of how I started in the podcast world, as far as like what I was into was listening to other people's stories about this kind of stuff and how they overcame it was always super, super helpful. I'm gonna read two more real quick. At Mikey YW718 says, masturbation, LOL, self-care 101. And actually, this is ironic. That was the one I was laughing at when I was scrolling through these responses. But ironically, my psychiatrist, because he was talking to me about my insomnia. I was going through insomnia for a little bit, and he said like, get your nighttime routine, take a TV out of your room, don't have your phone, all that kind of stuff. An hour before bed, whatever. And he's like, yeah, just get in bed. If you want to give yourself a personal massage, do that. But obviously he was talking about masturbation. But I mean, yeah, it's my inner child is giggling at that for no reason. But it is, something that is proven to increase those good feelings, to relax you, all of the above. I mean, obviously there's other conversations about like too much or the negative effects that like a lot of pornography could have. But in general, the idea of like masturbation, self-massaging, releases a lot of those stressors. So I'm glad you brought that up. Last one, at Director Key says, CBD gummies, stop, take deep calming breaths, positive rationalizing self-talk. And those are all really great. CBD gummies, I've tried a little bit to sleep, and it helped a little bit. I've recently gotten these drinks called Vibes. My girl put me onto them, and like a CBD drink, and I've noticed them like really, help out a bit with just like helping me chill out and calm down a little bit, I should say. And then positive rationalizing self-talk. Yeah, I think that's huge. I think one of the best things that I ever adapted was from Eckhart Tolle, and it's called The Power of Now. But he basically talks about how like seeing your thoughts not as you, but as like something separate, right? So it's almost like you're looking at yourself from the outside, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like it's almost like an out of body experience. And that's how I began to adapt. When I got a thought in my head, and particularly we're talking about negative ones, I would look at them as if it was somebody else's thought, right? And I would understand that that's not me, that's not who I am. And I would almost, at times, I would laugh at that thought, and I would tell myself that's not real, right? And I would have that conversation with it as if it was somebody else's thing. And that has been super helpful to me, and that brought up when you said rationalizing talk, that helped me with that, where I would be like, if I got a moment that said, oh, you're a failure, I would again, looking at it as somebody else, I would laugh and be like, that doesn't make any sense. You've done this, this, and that. You've achieved all these goals that you've wanted, and, you've done it as a good person, whatever it is. I'm giving myself some self-talk right now, but, rationally breaking down those negative thoughts has been super, super helpful for me. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And for me, I'm going to quickly go through my own recipe that I've recently developed, right? And I've been calling this a success recipe. I might change the name. It's just what I put off in my my notes, but it was basically, a conversation I had with my life coach that I recently got. There's a really dope app called coach.me where you can, for relatively cheap, it's like $20 a week. You can get a life coach who specializes in different things, but whether it's trying to find more discipline, trying to achieve different goals. I did it years ago to help me break down my 3-month, 1 year, and 5-year goals or whatever it is, right? Help me develop a way of tangibly seeing results. And now I use this one. This guy's more of a meditation, expert, but also it's helped me cultivate presence. And also I think as a result, helping give me an alternative to talk therapy, which I felt like wasn't working for me at this point in my life right now. But I still wanted to get the help and explore these different ideas, so he's put me onto a lot of cool meditations that have been helping me a lot. I'll put a link in the show notes, the one that's been helping me the most. So a lot of links for y'all to go through, but I'm going to quickly go through this list that I had based off a conversation him and I had, as well as conversations, like I said, that I've had with my girlfriend in the past. But one of the things I wrote down was time off and breaks are essential, and basically, reframing the idea of time off not being a negative thing, but instead it's actually an asset that I need in order to be, firing on all cylinders. And also in order to find success, I need to have that time off to allow my brain to rest, right? It's a necessary recipe. And that's sort of been helping me because I was someone who never took time off and worked from the time I woke up to the time I went to bed and never took vacations, right? So understanding that it's an essential part of my life and retraining my brain to not look at it as something stupid, but instead something essential for my success. I wrote down flow state is sacred and needed daily. Like that, when you find yourself and you just get lost in something and an hour has gone by and you don't know how fast that, you don't know how the fuck that happened. That's what I mean by flow state. I try to do something each and every day, something creative that puts me in that flow state where I at least get lost for an hour each day. And that's been really helping me. Community, having people to bounce ideas off of. I've been talking about conversation with my parents or my girl, having that community and having just friends in general, I think is essential. It's something I've begun to realize at this point in my life. Playtime is essential. I say weekly, if possible, more. Just be a kid. Do something fun just for the sake of having fun. I go on to say, and moving down, I'm going to quickly try to get through this list. I know I'm saying a lot, but deep, passionate, and vulnerable conversations and check-ins are energizing and needed weekly, if not more. This is something that's been huge for me, and it's part of the revelations that I've been having as of late. Not all conversations need immediacy, right? And I think that means setting boundaries, where if you don't have the space to have a particular conversation, be it your friends, family, spouse, having a system in place with them that they understand, I don't have space for that right now. Let's table it and we'll get to it later when I have the clarity, and that doesn't mean when you're in a bad mood, you don't want to talk to them. It could also just mean I'm in a flow state. I'm going to go work. I need to work on this creative thing to make myself feel good. And once I do that, I can have the space to have this conversation with you, and then daily meditation practice, followed by journaling. That's something that I've been readapting into my life and it's been helpful. And the other one for me that's been big is that if my mind is hyper-focused on a specific task and I can't get it out of my mind, address it and then return to being present in the moment, right? So there's been times I'm, at the house with my girlfriend and there's just one thing bothering me. I've been building up the studio for a minute. So there might be, I'm man, I really just wish I got a chance to finish, putting together that table, and understanding that my mental health is better if I am so obsessed with it. I should just go address it quickly, and then I can go back to being present and in the moment. Sometimes you just need to kind of allow yourself to indulge in that thing that is pressing on your mind, and obviously within reason. Physical movement daily. We talked about that, getting in shape. Daily mindful, quiet, or still time spent in nature or outside. I take my dog for walks, and I used to have headphones in, listening to a book or podcast. Now I do it without headphones. I just want to like be perceptive to nature around me and to like whatever's bouncing around in my head, and just be really present in that moment. No phone, and just allow myself to have that still time. Stillness is the key by Ryan Holiday. It talks about this a lot. I would suggest that. Clean space, clear mind. I'm a bit of a mess because I'm always running around doing different things, but I know that when I have a clean house, a clean studio, I feel so much better. And last one, have a weekly social media Sabbath. Man, on Sunday of this last weekend, for the first time in forever, did not go on social media at all. I purposely cut myself off. And don't get me wrong, I had like that itch where you're watching TV, a commercial comes on, I go open my phone to go on Instagram, and I purposely stopped myself from doing it. There were a couple of times I opened the app and I immediately closed it. So I purposely am trying to build that habit of like at least one day a week, cutting myself off completely from social media, because I also recognize that social media can be a trigger for me personally when it comes to those feelings of unworthiness and being unwanted or whatever it is, right? So understanding for me, even, beyond that, I don't use social media these last couple weeks until I get into my studio and it's time for me to start posting things. I'm living by this one quote that my girlfriend said, where post it and ghost it, as in post what you need to post because it's often, part of my job, but then don't go and obsess over trying to refresh, seeing the numbers every 5 minutes. You know what I mean? Post it and forget about it. So that's all things I've been trying to adapt. I know that was a bit long-winded, but I wanted to share that because I feel like, anybody that's looking for some sort of actionable steps. And for me, this is like a recipe I'm developing to give myself the balance that I need in order to try and remain healthy each and every day, right? All of those things contribute to balancing out the different parts of me so they're all working together and that they're all satisfied and happy. Now, with that said, let's quickly, tie a neat little bow around everything that we talked about today. And thank y'all for participating at DJ Dramos on Instagram if you want to be a part of these conversations. With that in mind, man, let's sum it all up in a segment we call Conclusion Stew.
Time for conclusion stew.
All right, so the one thing I just want to really, really reiterate is, again, depression, anxiety are not death sentences. There's not something wrong with you. You are not broken. This is not something that will last forever. Even me on medication, the plan is to only be taking it for a year. My psychiatrist, truly believes that with medication and therapy combined, or some form of therapy combined, you can then in a year wean yourself off and go on to living a far happier and healthier life, right? So even with medication not being a lifelong thing, right? So again, you're not broken. You're not destined to be miserable forever. You just have to figure out what is bringing this up for you and then put in the work to try and break some of those, really deep mental habits that you have and develop new ones that lead you to feeling far better mentally, right? And last thing I want to touch on, it's an article from healthline.com. I'm going to quickly go through it because I know we've been throwing a lot at you for this episode, but they say 10 best ways to increase dopamine levels naturally. Now, again, dopamine is that happy feeling, that adrenaline, that great feeling that we all want in our lives, that is the opposite of depression. Quickly, they say, number one, eat lots of protein. I've definitely noticed that when I change my diet in general to just being a little bit healthier, I feel better throughout the day, not just physically, but mentally. They go on to say eat less saturated fats. So like, things like butter and animal fat, eating less of that stuff can lead you to feeling much happier mentally. Consuming probiotics, your gut and your mind are often proven to be closely linked together, right? This is something like a lot of like acupuncturists talk about, right? If you have a messed up stomach, your mind is also going to be somehow, some way messed up. I don't understand how the fuck it works, but it definitely, again, makes sense when you put in the work on those things. I try to take a probiotic every day for that reason and to feel physically good, but also I've noticed a mental change. This one, I don't know what the fuck. Eat velvet beans. They're also, they say they contain high levels of L-dope, the precursor molecule to dopamine. Velvet beans. I got to look into that. Exercise often. I've talked about that a bit on the show today. We all know that. Get enough sleep. Again, this has been really huge for me. I do not negotiate with my sleep anymore. I make sure that, like, barring some sort of crazy responsibility that I have, I always set out to get 8 hours of sleep, even if it means I get into my office later than I like to, because I went to bed late. 8 hours of sleep to me is non-negotiable. I try and go to sleep at the same time every night, go to bed early, like 10 p.m., and ideally waking up at 6:30 in the morning. So that's been a huge one for me. Listening to music, they say it can be a fun way to stimulate dopamine, a dopamine release in your brain, which, again, part of my routine that I've been noticing, it really helps me out. I walk into my studio. First thing I do is turn on my speakers, turn on the Bluetooth, and I put on, music that puts me in a good mood. I put it on really loud, and that's always an amazing way to kind of start my workday. Meditating, I've recently gotten back into this, and it's been really groundbreaking for me now that I feel like I've found the right guided meditations. Again, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to the one that I've been listening to lately. That's been really, really helpful for me of being present. Number 9, they say get enough sunlight. I try and do this early when I go walk my dog first thing in the morning. We'll sit out there for 10, 15 minutes, just like in the sunlight when we first wake up. And that's been helping a little bit as well. And then they say considering, supplements. Say your body needs several vitamins and minerals to create dopamine, including iron, niacin, folate, and vitamin B6. So taking your supplements, I need to get better at that. Another natural way to help you increase dopamine. And I know it all sounds ridiculous, right? In general, the idea that we have to work so hard to feel happy, but you know what? That's just a part of life. The human mind is an incredible thing, but it's also incredibly sensitive, right? And if you've gone through something, or if you're born with that genetic, sensitivity gene, where maybe you're feeling a bit too much, you're too aware of things, you're going to inevitably be faced with trauma in your life, and those are going to create, certain patterns, right? Certain patterns, and we can either be angry at life, or we can say I recognize the severity of this, or the realness of these negative feelings, but I refuse to allow them to defeat me, and I'm going to experiment, and that's what this is all about. Experiment with seeing what helps me combat this, what helps me stay mentally healthy each and every day, and taking note of it. I gave you my recipe. I'm still adjusting it. You should create your own, adapt whatever works for you, and insert whatever things that personally work for you. Again, it's an ongoing work. I don't think the work ever stops until the day that we are no longer here on this earth. But again, it's about having that dedication to yourself and understanding that you don't have to feel shitty forever. You just have to put in the work towards figuring it out, and I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not taking away anybody's pain or trauma. I'm just reminding you that it's not a death sentence to have depression or anxiety, and there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Once again, as long as you put in the work and try and figure out what works for you and makes you feel good. And with that said, thank y'all so much for tuning into today's episode. I appreciate everybody who's been dropping new reviews. I've been seeing them. If you could do so, if you haven't yet, I would greatly appreciate it. A little 5-star review, a little positive comment, it goes a long way. Genuinely appreciate y'all. And man, Dramos.com for some merch. I'm working on some stuff for the next couple months. I've been teasing about a book, so I think we're going to have something the next couple months for y'all to check out. With that said, man, have an amazing start to your week, and I hope that this was helpful for a lot of people. And man, I'd love to hear certain things that you're trying to adapt, if it inspires you, to try and combat some of those, negative feelings that we all inevitably go through. I'd love to hear what your recipe is. Hit me up at DJ Dramos on social media, and I'll catch y'all on Thursday, man, for our Thursday Trends episode. So then, stay safe, and I'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.